She was 7 months pregnant, on her knees, scrubbing marble floors in a $5,000 dress his mother had ripped off her back an hour before. That was the moment Kang Soo-Jin walked through the front doors of his own mansion and saw his wife on the ground like a servant. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. The only sound in that house is his footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting louder with every step across the marble. My name is Aisha Jackson. 6 months ago, I was nobody in this family's eyes. Tonight, I am about to become the reason this entire empire changes forever. But to understand how I ended up on that floor, you have to understand everything that came before it. Let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in a small house with thin walls and a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. She cleaned houses for families who barely knew her name, who left her tip envelopes on kitchen counters like she was invisible furniture that happened to move. I used to sit on the porch waiting for her at night, watching the streetlights flicker on, promising myself I would build a life where nobody could ever look through me the way they looked through her. She used to tell me, "Baby, one day this world is going to try to make you small. Don't you ever let it." I held on to those words tighter than anything else I owned. In college, I fell in love with language. Not just Korean, though that became my obsession, but the idea that words could be a bridge between 2 worlds that were never supposed to meet. I studied international business during the day and Korean language and culture at night, staying up until 2 in the morning practicing formal speech patterns nobody in my life would ever need unless I made it happen myself. During my junior year, I spent 1 year abroad in Jeonju, living with a host family who changed the way I understood the world. My host mother, Yama Park, taught me things no classroom ever could. How to bow at the correct depth depending on who stood in front of me. How silence during a meal could be its own form of respect. How addressing someone by the wrong title could unravel an entire relationship before it even began. I did not know that education would one day save my life. After graduation, opportunities in Atlanta were limited, and the ones that existed paid me less than they paid people who looked nothing like me but knew half of what I knew. When a recruiter reached out about a translation position at a rising fashion house in Seoul, I didn't hesitate. I packed 2 suitcases, said goodbye to my mother at the airport with tears in both our eyes, and got on a plane toward a country I had only ever loved from a distance. The company was called Yoon International Textiles, owned by a woman named Yoon Ha-rin. On paper, she was brilliant. Sharp business instincts, magazine covers, invitations to every major event in Seoul's fashion circles. In person, she was cruelty wrapped in silk. The first week, during an all-staff meeting, she introduced me to 40 employees as our little diversity hire, here to make the company look progressive for international press. The room laughed politely, the way rooms do when the boss makes the joke. I smiled because I needed the job. I smiled because rent doesn't pay itself. I smiled because I told myself, this is temporary, this is not my whole story. But temporary humiliation still leaves permanent scars if you swallow it long enough. Ha-rin found new ways to remind me of my place almost weekly. She would speak to me in rapid, complicated Korean during meetings, watching my face for confusion, disappointed whenever I understood every word. She assigned me the most tedious contracts while giving my ideas to colleagues who repackaged them as their own in front of leadership. When I once corrected a translation error that would have cost the company a 6-figure deal, she thanked the man sitting beside me instead of me, the same man who had copied my note word for word onto his notepad 30 seconds earlier. I told myself, keep your head down. Keep working. The truth protects itself eventually. I did not yet know how wrong that belief would turn out to be. Then came the dinner that changed the entire direction of my life. Ha-rin's company was closing a partnership deal with a shipping and logistics conglomerate controlled by one of the most powerful families in Korea. I was assigned as translator for the meeting, a formality, nothing more, the kind of assignment given to someone whose presence in the room mattered less than the furniture. I walked into that private dining room and saw a man sitting at the head of the table, dressed entirely in black, his expression carved from stone, his eyes cold enough to lower the temperature of the whole room around him. That was Kang Soo-Jin. I later learned people called him the Winter Prince, heir to one of the most powerful conglomerates in Korea, feared in boardrooms and whispered about in circles that reached far beyond legitimate business. His father had died young, suddenly, under circumstances the tabloids never fully explained, and something in Soo-Jin had frozen the exact day they buried him. He ran his empire with ice in his veins and silence as his only language, and everyone at that table, including Harin herself, sat a little straighter in his presence. He barely looked at me when I took my seat at the far end of the table, but I noticed something the others missed. He listened to everything, every syllable, every pause, every glance exchanged between people who thought he wasn't paying attention. Halfway through the meal, two of the Japanese investors seated across from him began speaking quickly to each other in their native language, confident that no one at the table understood a word. They were plotting, quietly, casually, to undercut the agreed price the moment contracts were signed, laughing under their breath at how easy it would be to fool everyone in that room. I understood every single word. My heart pounded. I had a choice. Stay silent, stay safe, stay invisible the way I had trained myself to be for months, or risk everything for a stranger who had never once acknowledged my presence. I leaned toward him and whispered the truth in fluent, urgent Korean. They intend to renegotiate against you the moment ink touches paper. Do not sign tonight. His eyes lifted to mine for the first time all evening. Something shifted behind that frozen exterior. Sharp, curious, awake, like a man surfacing from underwater after holding his breath for years. He stood without warning and ended the meeting immediately, citing an unexpected family matter. The investors left the room confused, humiliated, caught in their own trap with no idea how they had been exposed. Harin sat frozen, unsure what had just happened at her own negotiation table. And Soo-Jin looked at me the way a man looks at something he never expected to find in a room full of nothing. That was the beginning. Not romance. Not yet. Just recognition. But recognition from a man like Kang Soo-Jin is dangerous currency in Seoul society. People noticed. People whispered. And one person in particular decided immediately that I had become a threat worth eliminating. Humiliating. I later learned that she and Soo-Jin's family shared a complicated history. An arranged engagement years earlier, orchestrated by both families for business reasons, collapsed under circumstances she never spoke about publicly, but never forgave either. Some said Soo-Jin's mother had personally ended the arrangement, believing Harin's family wasn't powerful enough. Others said Soo-Jin himself walked away without explanation. Whatever the truth, Harin carried that wound like a blade she was waiting to use. When she heard the Winter Prince had taken sudden, undeniable interest in her Black American translator, something venomous ignited behind her eyes. She started small, cutting my assigned hours without notice, forcing me to fight for shifts I had already been promised, spreading quiet rumors through the office that I was sleeping my way into opportunities, that my Korean fluency was exaggerated, performed, a party trick rather than genuine skill, telling coworkers in hushed voices meant to travel that ideas I generated myself were actually stolen from other departments. I kept my head down. I kept working twice as hard as everyone around me, arriving earlier, staying later, perfecting every translation until it was flawless, telling myself that if I simply proved my worth loudly enough through results, the truth would eventually protect me. I was wrong. Truth does not protect anyone. People protect people, and I had none in that building willing to stand beside me. 3 weeks after that dinner, Harin made her move. She fabricated a financial discrepancy buried inside a contract I had translated months earlier, altering numbers after the fact and dating the changes to make it appear as though I had falsified the figures to benefit a rival company. She brought the doctored documents directly to the board, tears in her own eyes, playing the wounded executive betrayed by someone she trusted. I was called into a conference room I had translated 100 contracts in and told, in front of 4 board members, that I was being terminated immediately for fraud. I tried to explain. I tried to show them the original documents I still had saved, proof that the numbers had been changed after my submission. Nobody looked at my evidence. Nobody wanted to look at my evidence. Harin had already decided the story before I walked into that room, and everyone in that building had already decided to believe her over me. Security escorted me out of the building in front of the entire office. I carried a cardboard box of my belongings clutched against my chest, tears burning behind my eyes, while people I used to eat lunch with, people who had laughed at my jokes in the break room, looked away like I had become invisible overnight, like humiliation was contagious, and they refused to catch it by association. I sat outside that building on the curb, phone shaking in my hands, unsure who in this entire country I could possibly call. My visa was tied to that job. My apartment was tied to that job. My entire life in Seoul, the one I had built from nothing, was collapsing in real time on a sidewalk while strangers walked past without a glance. Then I remembered the card Soo-Jin had quietly slipped in my palm after that dinner weeks earlier. No explanation attached, just a number and a single sentence. If you ever need someone to believe you. I called him, not because I expected saving, because I needed one single person in this entire country to know I was telling the truth. He answered on the second ring. He didn't offer comfort. He asked one question, calm and direct. Where are you right now? 20 minutes later, a black car pulled up to the curb where I sat. Soo-Jin stepped out himself. No assistant trailing behind him, no bodyguard announcing his arrival, just him walking directly toward me like the rest of the world had gone quiet around us. He didn't say sorry. He said, show me everything. Every email, every document, every name involved in this. That night, sitting in my small apartment surrounded by unopened moving boxes and unpaid bills that didn't know how I would cover, Kang Soo-Jin, a man feared by CEOs and government officials across 2 continents, sat across from a woman with absolutely nothing left and said 4 words that cracked something open inside me that I had kept sealed for years. I believe you completely. That was the first crack in the ice. Weeks passed. He said very little about what he was doing behind the scenes, only that I needed to trust him, that some things required patience and precision rather than speed. And for reasons I still cannot fully explain, reasons that went against every instinct that told me to trust no one with power, I did. Then everything shifted again, all at once on a night I never saw coming. His mother's company was hosting an enormous gala, celebrating a merger years in the making, the kind of event that filled magazine pages for weeks afterward. Soo-Jin needed a translator he trusted completely for a delicate negotiation involving North American investors who spoke in rapid, idiomatic English mixed with corporate slang his usual team struggled to keep pace with. He asked me to come, not as a favor, as the only person in Seoul capable of closing this deal cleanly, and both of us knew it. I stood in a ballroom filled with Korea's elite, wearing a dress Soo-Jin's assistant had quietly arranged, a dress that cost more than 3 months of my old rent, translating million-dollar terms in real time, while old money families stared at me like I had wandered into the wrong building entirely. Like my presence, there was a mistake someone would eventually correct. Then, the unexpected happened. One investor, confident and careless with champagne in his hand, made an offhand joke in English, mocking Korean business culture as superstitious, obsessed with numbers and dates that meant nothing in the real world. He laughed at his own joke. Nobody else did. The room went cold instantly. Soo-Jin's jaw tightened, and I watched years of carefully built goodwill threaten to collapse in a single careless sentence. I stepped forward before I even fully decided to. I bowed properly, the exact depth and duration my host mother in Jeonju had drilled into me years earlier. I addressed the eldest investor first, using formal, respectful language exactly as tradition demands, acknowledging his position before addressing anyone else in the circle. Then, in fluent, unhesitating Korean, I explained the deep philosophical roots behind numerology in Korean business culture, framing it not as superstition, but as centuries of accumulated wisdom around harmony, timing, and legacy, concepts far older and more sophisticated than anything Western business schools taught in a single semester. The room shifted completely. The elders nodded, visibly moved, several exchanging impressed glances with each other. The investor who made the joke sat in stunned silence, humiliated in front of his own colleagues. The deal that had nearly collapsed in careless insult was saved in under 2 minutes. Soo-Jin's mother, seated in the corner of that ballroom in a seat of honor, watched the entire exchange unfold with sharp, unreadable eyes. She watched a black woman from Atlanta save her son's most important merger using an understanding of Korean tradition sharper and more sincere than most people born into that tradition ever bothered to learn. She did not smile. Her eyes narrowed instead, calculating something dangerous behind that composed expression. Later that night, Soo-Jin found me alone on the balcony, staring out at the glittering Seoul skyline, my heart still racing from everything that had just happened inside. He said quietly, "No one has ever protected my family's name the way you did tonight. I don't know what to do with that feeling." I told him the truth, the one I had been protecting myself with for months. "I'm not trying to become part of your world, Soo-Jin. I'm simply trying to survive it." He stepped closer, closer than he had ever stood before. "Then let me help you survive it, as someone who matters," he said, not as someone hiding in the shadows of it. That was the night the Winter Prince chose me completely. If you're feeling this tension building right now, that means you are exactly where you need to be. This story is only getting started, and if slow burn drama like this hits different for you, go ahead and subscribe to AfroKorean Chronicles right now, because what happens between Aisha and Soo-Jin next is going to change everything you think you know about this story. Soo-Jin never did anything halfway. Once he decided I mattered, my entire life shifted direction, quietly but completely. He brought me into his world publicly, introduced me to his board of directors, not as a curiosity, but as the woman who had already proven her value twice over. He placed me in charge of international relations for his company, a position I had already been performing brilliantly in every way, but title long before anyone made it official. His mother, Madame Choi, despised the idea from the very first day she heard it whispered in her own household. She invited me to tea one afternoon, smiling the entire time while asking questions dipped in quiet poison. "Where exactly is your family from originally?" she asked, as though Atlanta were a foreign concept requiring translation. "Do you understand what it truly means to marry into a legacy like ours? Have you considered what society will say about children born from mixed lineage, carrying blood from two such different worlds?" I answered every question with as much grace as I could summon, refusing to give her the satisfaction of watching me crumble at her table. I told her, respectfully but firmly, that legacy isn't only measured in bloodlines. Sometimes it's measured in character. She smiled thinly and changed the subject, but something in her eyes told me the conversation was far from over. Grace, I would learn, does not stop cruelty. It only delays it. When Soo-Jin proposed 6 months later, in front of his entire extended family during a formal dinner meant to celebrate an entirely different occasion, Madame Choi's polished mask nearly slipped completely in front of everyone. She forced a smile for the cameras and the gathered guests, offering congratulations in a voice stretched thin with restraint, but her eyes told an entirely different story. The war between us had officially begun that night, even though only she and I understood it yet. Soo-Jin and I married in a small, private ceremony months later, intimate and real, deliberately kept far from his mother's guest list and her need for control. I wore my grandmother's earrings, the only piece of jewelry I owned that connected me to Atlanta, paired with a hanbok Soo-Jin had specially commissioned from a designer in Jeonju, blending both our worlds into a single image neither of us apologized for to anyone. For a while, life genuinely felt like peace. We traveled between business obligations and quiet mornings, learning each other in ways the public gala version of our relationship never captured. Soo-Jin, the man feared across 3 industries, became someone entirely different behind closed doors. Gentle, attentive, sometimes even playful in ways I don't think anyone besides me had seen since his father died. Then I became pregnant, and peace instantly became the perfect target. Madame Choi did not see the pregnancy as a blessing to celebrate. She saw it as a permanent, unbreakable tie she could never undo, a grandchild carrying my blood, set to inherit everything she believed belonged only to bloodlines that looked like her own. The moment the news spread through the family, her behavior toward me sharpened into something colder, more calculated, more patient. She waited carefully until Soo-Jin left for an emergency business trip to Singapore. Gone exactly 4 days, negotiating a crisis involving one of the company's overseas subsidiaries. She waited until his absence gave her the one thing she needed most: time, and no witnesses she couldn't control. She quietly dismissed the household staff who remained loyal to me, reassigning them to properties on the other side of the city under manufacture pretexts. She canceled my prenatal appointments without telling me, rescheduling them under false names buried in the household calendar, so I would miss every single one and believe it was my own mistake. She invited Yoon Harin, my old tormentor from the fashion house, back into the mansion under the guise of a business consultation, fully aware of the specific pain that reunion would cause me, and fully intending to use that pain as a weapon. And on the final night, before Soo-Jin's scheduled return, Madame Choi orchestrated the cruelest moment of my entire life. She informed the household staff, in front of me, that I was to be treated as help until further notice, stripped completely of authority and basic respect within a house that legally belonged to me as much as anyone. When I refused to comply with her demands, refused to lower my head and accept a role I had never agreed to, she grabbed the dress off my shoulders in front of the visiting guests she had personally invited, screaming that a woman like me did not deserve to wear anything bearing the Kang family name, not after embarrassing this family with my very existence. She forced me down on my knees on the cold marble, ordering me to scrub the floor of the very room where our wedding photographs hung proudly on the wall behind us, humiliating me in front of Harin, in front of the staff still present, in front of guests invited specifically to witness my fall from grace and carry the story back into Seoul society by morning. I was 7 months pregnant, crying, scrubbing floors in torn silk fabric, my entire body shaking, not from the physical strain, but from years of buried humiliation crashing back into me all at once. Every single moment from that fashion house boardroom to this marble floor colliding in the same unbearable instant. And that is exactly the moment the front door opened. Soo-Jin was not supposed to return until the following morning. But something inside him, some instinct he couldn't name, told him to come home early. Something told him this house was not safe without him standing in it. He stood frozen in the doorway of his own mansion and saw his pregnant wife kneeling on the cold marble floor. He saw his own mother standing over her, composed, unbothered, as if nothing unusual were happening at all. He saw Harin smirking quietly from the corner of the room, enjoying every second of it. The temperature in that entire room dropped instantly, and every single person present understood, without a single word spoken yet, that something irreversible was about to happen. When Soo-Jin's voice finally came, it was quieter than anyone in that room expected, and that quiet was far more terrifying than any scream could ever be. Everyone in this room, he said, is going to explain to me exactly what I am looking at right now. Madame Choi opened her mouth immediately, already prepared to twist the story in her favor the way she always had. But Soo-Jin raised a single hand, silencing her instantly without a single raised word, a gesture that carried more authority than his mother had commanded in years. He crossed the room in a few long strides and knelt beside me on the cold marble floor in his $3,000 suit, without hesitation, without a trace of shame at kneeling in front of guests, helping me to my feet with a gentleness that visibly shocked everyone watching, including his own mother. He turned to face her fully. "You have exactly one chance to explain to me why my wife, carrying my child, was on her knees scrubbing floors in her own home." Madame Choi straightened her spine, still desperately holding onto whatever control remained in the room. "I was simply teaching her the standards required to represent this family properly," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the first flicker of fear. Soo-Jin's jaw tightened visibly. "The only standard this family has failed to meet tonight," he said, "is basic human decency." He turned toward Harin next, his voice sharpening into something colder than I had ever heard from him, even in business meetings where fortunes hung on his words. "And you," he said, "you have spent years trying to destroy this woman's career, her reputation, her peace of mind. Tonight, You helped humiliate a pregnant woman on her knees in her own home. Do you fully understand what you have just done? Harin tried to laugh it off, tried to claim she was simply a guest, uninvolved in whatever had happened before her arrival, her voice thin with rising panic. Soo-Jin stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower, each word landing like a verdict already decided. I have had my legal team investigating the fraud case against Aisha for months, he said. I know everything. The falsified documents, the forged signatures, the financial records you personally manipulated to destroy her name and her livelihood at your own company. The room went completely, absolutely silent. Even the staff standing near the walls seemed to stop breathing. Soo-Jin continued, each sentence landing with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind for weeks, waiting only for the right time. Tomorrow morning, formal charges will be filed against you for fraud and defamation. Every business contact you have cultivated over the past decade will receive full documentation of exactly what you did, delivered personally by my legal team. Your reputation, the one thing you have always valued more than your own conscience, is about to disappear entirely, and there is nothing left in this city that can protect you from that. Harin's face went pale, all color draining from it in real time. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but nothing came out. The woman who had humiliated me in front of 40 employees, who had orchestrated my public firing, who had smiled through every act of cruelty for over a year, stood utterly speechless in the middle of a room she thought she controlled. Soo-Jin turned back to his mother, his voice softening only slightly, though the authority behind it never wavered. Effective immediately, he said, you no longer have access to company funds, family accounts, or any decision-making authority within this household. You will remain in this house out of respect for my father's memory, and nothing more than that. If you ever disrespect my wife again, in any way, that respect disappears too, and so does your place in this family entirely. Madame Choi's composure finally cracked, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in over a year. Soo-Jin, she said, her voice trembling now. I am your mother, he said, and she is my wife, the mother of my child. The woman who has shown more grace under your cruelty than you have ever shown anyone in this entire family, including your own son. Loyalty is earned, not inherited. Tonight, you lost yours completely. He turned to me then, his hand resting gently against my stomach, his voice softening entirely as he looked into my eyes. I am so sorry I wasn't here soon enough to stop this, he said. But I promise you, from this moment forward, no one in this world will ever make you feel small again. Not while I'm breathing. I broke down, crying in his arms, right there on that marble floor, not from sadness, but from something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Relief. Safety. Being fully, completely seen by someone with the power to change everything. The following weeks changed absolutely everything. Harin was formally charged with fraud and defamation, exactly as promised. Her company severed all ties with her within 72 hours once the truth became public knowledge, the board moving swiftly to distance themselves from the scandal. The very elite social circles she had once used to manipulate and destroy others turned their backs on her overnight. The same cold shoulder she had given me for over a year now aimed squarely at her, with none of the mercy she had ever shown anyone else. Madame Choi, humiliated publicly by her own son's decision in front of the household staff and guests who witnessed everything, retreated into a silence I had never once heard from her before, stripped entirely of the power she had used like a weapon for decades. And me, I was elevated, not because Soo-Jin needed to prove a point to his mother or to Seoul society, but because he refused to let the truth stay buried any longer beneath politeness and tradition. He named me Vice President of International Relations for Kang Enterprises, a role I had already been performing brilliantly long before anyone gave it an official title, a role I had earned through skill and sacrifice rather than through marriage. At the company's annual gala months later, the same glittering event where Harin had once watched me humiliated by careless investors, I walked in on Soo-Jin's arm, 7 months pregnant, dressed not in borrowed grace, but in my own undeniable, hard-earned power. The same people who once whispered about the diversity hire, who once looked away when I was escorted out of a building in humiliation, stood and applauded when Soo-Jin introduced me, not as his wife, but as the woman who had saved this company more times than anyone in that room would ever fully know. Madam Choi watched from the back of the room that night, invited only out of formality, stripped of power, stripped of control, forced to witness the very daughter-in-law she had tried to destroy, standing at the absolute center of everything she once believed belonged only to her. Months later, I gave birth to our daughter. Soo-Jin held her in his arms for the first time. This powerful, feared, cold-hearted businessman, known throughout 2 continents, reduced to quiet tears over a tiny life that carried both our bloodlines fearlessly, unapologetically, completely. He looked at me, exhaustion and joy mixed together in his eyes, and said, "We built something they tried to destroy before it even had a chance to exist. And it is stronger than any of them ever imagined it could be." I used to believe the world would always try to make me small. Instead, I became the reason an entire empire changed forever. If this story moved you, if you felt every single moment of Aisha's fall and every second of her rise, make sure you're subscribed to AfroKorean Chronicles, because stories like this one are only the beginning. Turn on notifications, drop a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs to believe their comeback is coming too. Because sometimes, the lowest moment of your life is simply the universe preparing your greatest rise.